historic opportunity. The economic and social advancement of blacks in this country is still a great unfinished task. The methods and approaches for dealing with this task have become familiar over the past few years, and they demand re-examination for at least two reasons. First is the effectiveness of these approaches has been ever more seriously questioned in recent years. There's growing factual evidence of counterproductive results from noble intentions. Some of that factual evidence will be presented here tomorrow. In addition, numerous political trends in recent years indicate declining voter and taxpayer support for these approaches to which some of the older and more conventional black spokesmen, in quotes, remain committed. The events of November 4th were only the most dramatic example of this. They were not the only example. What are some of the pluses and minuses of our present situation? On the plus side, a dramatic economic rise of blacks during the 1960s, but which is slowed, in some cases stopped, in the 1970s. Many social problems are worsening. Continued disintegration of families, rising numbers of broken homes, 1/3 of all black homes now. A skyrocketing unemployment rate among black youths, 5 times as high in the late 1970s as in the late 1940s. Runaway crime rates, of which blacks are the chief victims. There are more blacks murdered every year than whites in absolute numbers. There's also a threat of a permanent underclass whose problems seem immune to prosperity, to equal opportunity, or to the advancement experienced by other blacks. We can see on the horizon the rise of racist groups such as the Nazis, the KKK, not only among the benighted, ignorant, but in places where you would never expect such groups, where they never had a foothold before. We can at least ask whether or to what extent the policies of our times have contributed to these problems of our time. Looking ahead to the future, one of the things that we need to focus on are facts about results, not rhetoric about intentions. We need to look not at the noble preambles of legislation, but at the incentives created in that legislation. Very often legislation intended to help the disadvantaged, in fact, pay people to stay disadvantaged, penalize them to the extent that they make an effort to rise from disadvantage. One of the problems in dealing with the politics of poverty and the programs for the disadvantaged in general, and blacks in particular, is that vast empires can be built on these programs. That these programs definitely prevent poverty among bureaucrats, economists, statisticians, and many others. I think that what this betrays is a sense, a sort of proprietary conception of blacks, somewhat at variance with the spirit of the 13th Amendment. I think that if insofar as we're going to enlist the intelligence, the desires, and the commitments of blacks themselves, we have to do so by offering more choice in more areas, to let them decide what is best for themselves and not to turn that job over to academics and government officials. Thank you.
Good evening, good evening. On behalf of the American Enterprise Institute, welcome to Old Parkland Conference number 3 in Washington, D.C. As I said before, my name is Ian Rowe, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. What you just saw and heard was the great Thomas Sowell kicking off the Black Alternatives Conference at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco in December 1980. Which remains an inspiration for our gathering today. As Professor Sowell said, this is really a historic opportunity. The economic and social advancement of blacks in this country is still a great unfinished task. There is almost nothing in Mr. Sowell's introductory remarks in 1980 that are not still highly pertinent as we kick off Old Parkland in 2025. To some degree, the enduring relevance of Professor Sowell's words showcase not only his prescience in long ago identifying worrisome trends that were then in their infancy, but also highlights that the past he warned us about have become prologue. In 1980, Sowell organized the Fairmont Conference because he had observed an emerging duality that before the advent of affirmative action, racial preferences, expansion of the welfare state, there had been significant progress in the Black community in several areas during the first 2/3 of the 20th century. Median annual income of Blacks had risen dramatically. Blacks had higher marriage rates than whites. There were persistent declines in poverty, with about half of all Blacks moving into the middle class by the mid-60s. All of this prior to civil rights legislation. So promising were these trends in Black progress that in Chapter 1 of the famous 1965 report by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, this period of Black advancement is referred to as the Negro American Revolution. And I'll quote from it. It's worth listening to these words. The Negro American Revolution is rightly regarded as the most important domestic event of the post-war period in the United States. It holds forth the prospect that the American Republic, which at birth was flawed by the institution of Negro slavery, and which throughout its history has been marred by the unequal treatment of Negro citizens, will at last redeem the full promise of the Declaration of Independence. Despite this optimism, Sowell, like Moynihan in his report, saw that this Negro American Revolution was at risk. Sowell's research indicated that in the late 1960s and early 70s, there was a diverging reality that would make a growing segment of the Black community, as he said, a permanent underclass whose problems seem immune to prosperity, to equal opportunity, or to the advancement experienced by other Blacks. This was the turning point in the late 1960s when Sowell recognized that racial gaps that had been narrowing in several areas were now starting to widen. So how do the issues Sowell identified back in 1980 stack up against what the Black community faces today? In education, our Manhattan Institute colleague Jason Riley has just written in his great new book, The Affirmative Action Myth, which I know Glenn Lowry just interviewed Jason on. He writes about Harvard political scientists Robert Putnam and Shaylin Garrett, who document that the fastest and most dramatic progress toward parity between Blacks and whites finishing high school was achieved before 1970. After 1970, the relative rate at which Blacks were completing college dropped, then flatlined, and never recovered its previous upward trajectory. Another area of concern to Sowell in 1980 was the downward shift in Black marriage rates. I find this stat stunning. According to the US Census Bureau, between 1890 and 1970, Black women 35 or over were less likely to have never been married than their white counterparts. The crossover occurred in 1970 when the racial gap reversed from Blacks being more likely to marry than whites to being the other way around. Over the next few decades, marriage has become a declining institution among all Americans, and this pattern is particularly evident in the Black community. And this chart vividly shows the juggernaut leap in racial disparity after 1980, when the percentage of Black women aged 35 and over who never married grew far higher relative to white women. And as this Pew study shows, in 2021, nearly half of all Black 40-year-olds have never married, dwarfing other racial categories. We'll hear a lot more about this tomorrow morning from Melissa Kearney when we're talking about two-parent privilege. But similar to the acceleration of lower Black marriage rates, since the late 1960s, there was a dramatic increase in the rate of Black non-marital births. In 1965, when the Moynihan Report was written, the non-marital birth rate in the Black community was 23.6%. We would kill for that today. Like these other forces, as this chart shows, the red line there shows the Black community, there was a turbo boost in the mid-1960s as the Black out-of-wedlock birth rate has now skyrocketed to 70% today. And then in terms of violence, you heard Sowell lament that in 1980, there were more Blacks murdered every year than whites in absolute numbers. Unfortunately, that data is still true today. You'll hear more of that from Ralph Mangual tomorrow as well. But according to the Violence Policy Center, there were 13,446 Black homicide victims in the United States in 2022. This represented 54% of all homicide victims, despite Black Americans comprising only 13.6% of the US population. So not only are more Blacks still murdered every year than whites in absolute numbers, there are more Blacks murdered than all other races combined. Yet absolute numbers of violent deaths by race do not tell the full story, as they don't fully reveal the significant racial disparities in age when someone is murdered, masking the disproportionate number of homicide victims who are younger Black people. One particularly sobering statistic is called potential years of life lost. This is the number of additional years a person murdered would have lived had they survived to the average age of life expectancy specific to that racial or ethnic group. According to the National Violent Death Reporting System and the Centers for Disease Control, I'm sad to report that the potential years of life lost for African American homicide victims is nearly 42 years, dwarfing that of white homicide victims. So as Sowell did 45 years ago, we are gathered here to confront the conditions that seem to plague that segment of the Black community that's heartbreakingly trapped in a cycle of despair. What drove those successes for the Negro American Revolution in the first two-thirds of the 19th century? And to what extent do the policies of our times have they contributed to the lack of Black advancement since then? As we spend the next day and a half considering new opportunities to empower and advance Black mobility, it's worth taking stock of the current moment. A long-awaited national reckoning is finally occurring, but perhaps different than many of us may have expected. Ray Teixeira will be talking about this tomorrow, but as the 2024 presidential election showed, there has been a dramatic change in America's electorate, particularly in non-white and working-class voters. Since 2012, there's been a 15-point shift towards the right among Black voters, a 32-point shift amongst Asian voters, and a 38-point shift among Latinos. These demographic shifts indicate another emerging possibility as well. In my view, there have been three major falsehoods that have driven racial politics for more than a generation. But they are being challenged more than any point in certainly my lifetime. What are these three? One, any racial disparity in outcomes is the result of racism. You see this assumption everywhere. Two, racial preferences are necessary for Black advancement. Three, equality of racial outcomes, or equity, must replace or supersede equality of opportunity. In my view, these three underlying beliefs have been a source of so many reductionist policies that see human beings through the singular prism of race, devoid of agency, incapable of meeting high standards, and dependent upon the government or systems that actually undermine true freedom, enterprise, and opportunity. but the dam may be breaking. In 2023, the Supreme Court nullified the use of race-based affirmative action in college admissions. In February, the president issued a flurry of executive orders to, quote, restore equality of opportunity and meritocracy, end quote, eliminating the use of disparate impact liability in all contexts. Hundreds of large US companies are aggressively scaling back or abandoning DEI initiatives. At least 33 states now have some form of publicly funded private school options, including Texas, which just passed a $1 billion voucher school program, empowering up to 100,000 families to be able to spend $10,000 on the school of their choice, including religious schools. Whatever you may think about all of those changes, something is happening in our country which creates a unique opportunity for this discussion. So we are coming together at what I think is a very important and tumultuous time. We're honored to have you here and ask for your active participation as we look at a range of factors, including how neighborhoods, families, education, all of those factors impact Black mobility. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Mr. James Heckman. Come on, James. Jim Heckman is an American economist, Nobel laureate, who serves as the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. We had a great event at Chicago just a few months ago focused on how to cultivate agency in the rising generation. I'm very honored to welcome Jim Heckman to the floor to help us think about the relationship between family structure, parenting, and skill development. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here tonight and to discuss some ideas that I've had and really haven't displayed too publicly, and sometimes been a little bit afraid to discuss these ideas. So I want to talk about the work that I've been doing on the family and what the important ingredients are about family life. And I'll build on everything that's been said before, but in my own way, so we'll see. So I want to talk about first, which I believe is a proposition that many of you will accept, is that and it's one of your propositions, Ian, that really this idea that somehow there's systemic discrimination overtly working against African Americans, I don't think anybody thinks of that as a serious question anymore, and when one looks at what disparity is all about. And what I want to do is give you some examples that come just from standard labor economics adjustments, and that is how if you just look at the gaps between blacks and whites, males and females, and you look at what the differences are, that what you see is basically a substantial gap. This is what's from a standard survey called the NLSY 79, sorry. But when you adjust, and what do I mean by adjustment? By cognitive and social skills, of which I'm going to say more. When you make that adjustment, you can start seeing that the gaps that are very substantial, if you just look at raw data, go away. And so the question then becomes, what do we make of that? And I think this is a very important point. And this is also true if you look at college entry proportions. We can see basically that affirmative action has played a very powerful role. But when we adjust for ability, we see that actually blacks are overrepresented compared to whites, and Hispanics also overrepresented compared to whites. So these are facts. And these are just some of many, many facts that show how skills that individuals have play a very important role. But what I want to talk about tonight is what forms those skills. And I think we need to think very much more about how families and other environments, besides families, but mainly families in my talk tonight, are influential in shaping the way that these skills form. And some of the ideas that we have somehow embedded in the discussion, I think really need to be challenged or thought about more actively and more constructively. So we know, and we're going to discuss this, Sol was talking about this, and if we just look at statistics on inequality, in the United States and just look at income inequality, single-parent families are major sources of income inequality. If we just look at family units, they're huge. But also, they're major sources of skill gaps. And families are playing a major role in creating the skills. So I want to dissuade you of the idea that these skills are somehow genetically determined. And that in fact, things like IQ, that social and emotional skills, and many of the factors that make us as human beings, that define our ability to perform, are somehow fixed at birth. I'll show you, in fact, a very dramatic slide that really questions the validity of a lot of the so-called genetic explanations. So let me give you an example. And this is an example taken from some work that I did some years ago, but it's one that's been found in many countries around the world, in Hong Kong, in England, Colombia, and other places. And if you just look at the achievement test scores of children by age, and these are things like AFQT or things like Iowa Achievement Test and so forth, and age-adjusted versions of these, what you see is something very interesting. That if you go from the bottom to the top, you go from high school dropouts or less to college graduates, you can see that children and families where the mother or the major caregiver is highly educated do much better. That's one point. But secondly, and this is something that's really important, now the actual parallelism you see here is not perfect, but this is American data. And we can see a parallelism that's there. And this is true throughout the whole life. Not just, it certainly is true by age 5 that what we see in terms of gaps is also present at age 18. So if we want to blame the schools, and we want to blame a lot of the standard institutions, they simply can't be blamed. I mean, they're forces, but that's not the major source of this discrepancy. You could look at that. Oops, I think I just put myself in a box here. How do I go back? I think I can go back, yes. And here's the version of this. The vocabulary and the environment in which children are raised play a major role. So you can see, for example, among children, where the parents are making many verbal statements and giving the children verbal bath, those children, the mother's speech, plays a powerful role in the vocabulary that children have at early ages, and that persists throughout the life of the child. And here's another example of something that is done by a group at Stanford some years ago now, showing the importance of home environments and how the education of the mother, the cultural environment of the home, is playing a huge role in what the education, what the children's, as adults, how they're speaking and what their vocalizations are and the way they're engaging the larger society. But I want to also make a point, which I think maybe is sometimes missed by people because genes are always very popular. I would say the importance of genetic explanations is grossly exaggerated. And I'll show you something which you may or may not have seen. This is basically DNA from identical twins. And we think of identical twins as having exactly the same DNA. However, life is not identical for identical twins. And it turns out that the genes themselves do nothing. The genes lead to expression. And the way the gene expression is altered can be heavily altered by the nature of the environments in which people live in. And so here on the left side of this graph, or these graphs, you see a pair of SNPs from a gene of identical twins that are 3 years old. And already at age 3, the different colorations suggest that these identical twins, literally identical genetic material, already have different coloration. If you go to age 50, you can see substantial differences. And what this means is that even those explanations, which are cheap and easy to do, are false. The so-called identical twin studies, all of those have to be seriously questioned. So that's something that just should be kept very much in reserve when people start talking about genetic explanations. But now, as Sol was saying, and I think we're going to hear more of throughout this conference, the whole environment for children has changed a lot in the United States. And some of this we can claim and maybe due to government policies. We're going to get into that discussion, I guess. But I'm not going to make that discussion tonight. I just want to point out, though, if you look at the number of children, 18, that are living in never married homes, environments where there's no marital stability. No marital status ever, never, and there are obviously other family structures as well, that has grown tremendously over this period. Now, why is that important? That may or may not be important, just looking at this figure. But what we can also see is that there are important differences. If we ask, where are the children being born in these never married parents, the incidence of those is very high among families where the mother or the family unit, really the mother in this case, is a dropout from high school. So some of the individuals who are not very highly educated are the ones who are having families without children, never married and having children, so in adverse environments. And if we then start looking at exactly the kind of data that Ian was talking about and Sol was talking about, we can see a tremendous growth, especially strong among the Black community, but also true among Hispanics and other groups as well. So I think that's what we want to think of is really very important finding. But if you look at skill measures, for example, again, by the education of the mother, and we look at how skills develop over ages, so look at things like math score. For example, for boys and girls, there's some difference in these developments. But what you can see is that the more educated mothers are having children with much higher education level in terms of math score, much better achievement level. If you look at the same thing for Black families, similar pattern, but the level is lower. And so there really is a serious gap here. It's partly linked to education, partly linked to this, but there's something else going on. And that's what I want to talk about. What else is going on? So let me just show you some very dramatic differences here. And these are things that are very unpleasant to talk about. In fact, I get a lot of papers in the course of my day. I'm sure that some of you also get these papers saying that to talk about gaps is a terrible thing, and that to talk about the fact that there are gaps really is done to humiliate individuals and done in a very negative way. But I honestly believe that unless we really understand these gaps were not created by any racist organization. These are organizations looking exactly at these test scores. And what you can see is that it's done in a very objective way. And for both males and females, Blacks, whites, and Hispanics, what we're going to see is that minorities are basically much more represented in the lower quartiles, the lower percentiles of the overall ability distribution. And that's something that has to be taken into account. And when you look at things like, and this is something I think is very important that we look at, what are the determinants of these factors? Well, here is a table that's very busy. Ian told me not to show it. I will. But what I'll do, well, it also shows how the gaps depend on things. The white-black, the white-Hispanic gap, you can see that there are substantial differences, even depending on whether the mother's a dropout, mother's a high school graduate or not. But the frightening thing about this is that most of these gaps, and these gaps are stated, so if you look at the first column, those gaps are essentially showing very strong levels, even at the highest levels of mother's education. So we start looking to things like education expansion as a cure, as a way to address the gaps. We're missing the point. But I break out something that's relevant for this conference as a whole. The lower set of bars here, which shows what are the gaps, white, black, Hispanic, black, white, Hispanic, and white, black gap. If you look, for example, in children raised in broken homes, children raised in intact homes, what you see is a huge gap in these structures. And there's a big difference in being in an intact home. This is from data from the 1979 National Longitudinal Survey. However, let me just go to the punchline here, that when we look at later data, what we find is something very, very interesting, that when you look at more subtle family structures, for example, parents are single, never married. We look at blended families where the parents are bringing together children from different marriages or different associations together in the family, and we have intact families. We find that there are substantial gaps within each of these categories. But the thing that's most interesting in my mind, and for this conference, was the fact that those gaps are pretty much the same across all those family structures. So it's not just a matter of married and not married. And I think that's a very important finding, that it's not, and people have looked deeply into this. So the idea that marriage per se is some kind of a cure, it's a signal of a healthy environment, but it's not necessarily providing us. So this table I would view as Exhibit A in my talk. I would just sit down and talk. If you want me to stop, I will, because this is really what I want to say. But I want to say a little more. But also, when we think about family structures, we also know that family structures differ a lot across environments. So when you look at cohabitation, and this is Danish data now, you can find actually that children who are basically in more stable married couple units are showing greater levels of self-regulation by family status, no question about it. Cohabiting couples, well, not so much. But if you break that out, and you can find that stable cohabiting couples, and that's very common in places like Denmark, long-term cohabitation, just no marriage, those are almost indistinguishable from the family structures that are married. So don't worry about cohabitation. At the bottom, though, the single mother, you're still finding substantial gap. And if you look at other traits that we think are important, you get a similar kind of gap in the sense of development of empathy, something really important for social participation. So just give you an idea how different the different family environments are. Some of this can be explained by education, some of it can be explained by culture, and we need to really understand this. So if you look at investment again, these are bar graphs. So if there was uniformity and equality in the nature of the investment in these distributions, these are whites and Hispanics and blacks in this overall distribution, you get an even bar, 10% everywhere. But what you find is a concentration of the minorities at the lower levels in terms of family environment measured by just material goods. Cognitive stimulation may be even more important, and I think the evidence points in that direction. So we see huge gaps in this array. So we also can see other ways, emotional support. In many different ways that we measure the way families are functioning, we see huge gaps. So I'll answer what can be done. We can sort of look at this and say, oh, what do we need to do? And a lot of people have tried to address these questions, and now for many years have been trying to do it. There's a program I've worked on for many years, which I think has some insights, and I'll talk about it. It's a program that's underlying the Head Start program, but it's also universally used, parts of it everywhere. And what it shows is that it's a very effective program. And why is it effective? Well, I don't want to get into all the details because I don't have that much time. But it's 2 hours a day for 2 years, and the children are basically taught to interact in a positive way with their environment. Plan, do, review. And we see very high rates of return. But also, and this is something that people don't fully accept and don't understand, is that IQ is boosted in a permanent way. And this program has now been following the kids from age 3 and 4 to age 55. So it's not like this. It's not so many of these evaluations you see are taken 6 months after the program was begun or 10. We look only at long-term evaluations, and these are lasting effects. And I can show you that. But the point is, and executive functioning, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a matter, I would say it has to do with agency, the ability to control oneself, the ability to control one's emotion. These are long-run effects, and they're very powerful. So in terms of aggressive behavior and so forth, much improvement. But the interesting thing about these programs is by improving the family in this way, there are effects that last over generations. So not only do you know what happened to the original children, we know what happened to their children. So these people who are in the program enrolled in 1960, they have children now, and we can look at them. And what we find is those children do extremely well. I can't go through the whole category, but they're doing extremely well in this. And we can see that in terms of high school graduation, in terms of arrests and so forth and so on. And there are also strong effects that spill over to the other children in the family. So what you're doing is enriching family life by enriching parenting. And I think that's a very important strategy that we need to think about. If you do a standard economic calculation, you get very high rates of return. But one thing that I'll just point, and coming back to the point about IQ, is what we can do is look at the intergenerational dependence. It's a very well-established fact that if the father commits crime or is engaged in crime, the son is more likely to do so. And that's what these data show here on this black column here on the left. That's essentially the participation in crime. It's a correlation between or regression correlation between the child's participation in crime, the education, sorry, in the first category, and the second column would be crime. And what you see is the dark category is what happens in the so-called control group that didn't get these kinds of parenting interventions. The other column, that little dark line that's close to 0, is exactly what the correlation is for those people who receive these kinds of parenting interventions. So not only are you boosting the family, but you're actually breaking this intergenerational link. And the same thing is true for males and for females. And there's a related program in Dublin where essentially, looking at measures of IQ at age 4 and age 9, the people who got this treatment were fundamentally different. And so what's going on? And this is what I argue, and I'll stop. I promised Ian I would stay on time. I have, 20 more minutes? Sorry. No, I'll stop. I'll stop very soon. But if you look at parental warmth, and again, it's not surprising, but this is something that is not always pushed. People, you see, this gets very soft and fuzzy. For an economist to be talking about these things sounds like I've just lost my mind. On the other hand, this is what's going on. This is actually what is going on. And we actually now have parenting programs that are going around the world that are built on this principle of basically not working directly with children, but working with parents or caregivers to learn to work with children. So you're building homes. You're not going around and just instructing children in some public program. You're really going in. So look, one of the things that I think is very important, and again on the theme of this conference, is that treated children in this Perry study were much more likely to be married. And so that's part of the reason why their children did so well. They grew up in better families, more married, but notice that the marriage rates start going down in the late 40s, but that's all right. The age of childbearing is over and the child rearing is over. And it's in those critical years that children are actually getting the stimulation that goes on. Big effects on arrests, and we can see huge effects on earnings. And what we do have is other programs like this. So I think that what we can say is there's a program in Jamaica that I've been involved with. It's now been going, it was initially started, I think, in 1980s, and we have data on these through the present day. These kids are in their 30s, going into their 40s. And again, what we can see is the children. What is the program? The program is not some big school. It's not even a big Head Start program. It's not. What it is, it's basically going into the home, educating the mother, and working with the mother by somebody who is of the same culture and the same background as the mother, and giving the mother some advice about some ways to play with the child and stimulate the child. But the target is the mother, and the mother then raises the child. And there are these effects at age 30. We look at IQ, we look at reasoning, we look at a lot of measures of executive functioning. In all of these dimensions, we can see successful interventions. And we can also look at aspects of depression and other kinds of mental conditions. And college enrollment is very big. These are all disadvantaged kids in the slums of Kingston, Jamaica. And there are adolescent interventions that play a powerful role. And I can't really talk about it, but in the current population. But I do want to finish with one note. And that is, there's been a lot of attention about the role of neighborhoods as if they have some powerful, independent role. And sociologists have been pushing this line for years. At my own school, the University of Chicago, there was a whole culture in the sociology department talking about the value of neighborhoods and how neighborhood efficacy played a major role in what was really shaping the lives of people in those neighborhoods. But what happens, what's missed in a very systematic way, is the crucial point that families are choosing neighborhoods. Families are choosing neighborhoods. The neighborhood just doesn't rain down on you. And there are a lot of studies that are very widely cited that are going around saying, oh, we can treat it as if the neighborhood was somehow randomly assigned. I'll show you one study and then I will stop. So there's you can read a lot of popular press, zip code is destiny, but I think we need to understand the important role of parents again in choosing and shaping neighborhoods. So I'll give you an example. If you ask, when do parents move into the neighborhood where children are going to be exposed? It's not when the kid is 10 years old. It's generally before the kid is even born. This, you think about parents forming neighborhoods, they move out to schools, they're choosing the neighborhoods, and that's a fact. And this is true. This turns out to be, well, this is a number of countries, and this fact holds. And now there's a whole literature which has become influential, where people are saying, okay, look, the more highly exposed, the longer a child is exposed to a neighborhood, the higher the child is in some kind of adult income rank in the overall population. That's very popular, and it's become very influential. And certainly you can see it published and printed, and it's taken almost as gospel truth. But let me show you something. Using exactly the same methodology, you can show the same methodology about exposure to the neighborhood and the neighborhoods being good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods. If you use the same methodology, you can prove that the birth length and the birth weight of a child also depends on the exposure to the neighborhood when they're 16 and 17. So think about that for a second. This can't possibly be true. The parents picked the neighborhood. The parents chose the environment. And it's that thing that is truly missing in this environment, discussing. So there's a lot of uncritical statements about neighborhood effects and so forth and so on. I'm not denying that peers can play an important role, but I do think that we have to understand it's these families that are picking neighborhoods. And even, for example, when we think about things like movement to opportunity and when children are being sort of moved from one neighborhood to another, when vouchers were given in Chicago anyway, they were said, okay, you can move to a good home or a Section 8 home, and there are various voucher programs. Some of the work by some of my students and others as well have looked at this and say, where do parents go? Well, the parents go as close as they can to their own neighborhoods, their own friends. They may go the next block over or the next neighborhood over, but it's pretty close to the same neighborhood. And so I think we really have to rebuild the focus. It's not just that they're an occasional comment. It's the parenting and the choices of parents that are shaping the whole story. So thank you very much for your attention. And sorry, Ian, I spent a little too much time. I was pretty close.
That was pretty good. That's it.
Okay.
Yes, another round of applause to Professor Heckman for being on time.
See, I told you.
No, you said you were a Boy Scout.
He was frightened. There was 65
There were 65 slides.
But I mean, you can say it, and you can all have these slides if you want. I mean, they're public.
Yes.
They're in the public domain, so there's not. That's why I put it. There's even more slides.
Yeah, I'm aware. I'm aware. So there's actually much I want to speak to you about, in particular the finding that family structure is important, but it may not be the most important factor. But before we get there, you started your comment by saying that you don't normally speak about these kinds of issues because they're pretty prickly. So I'd love to just get a sense, when you, Nobel laureate, makes a powerful presentation which is clearly data-rich and evidence-filled, there's a hesitation to speak on issues of race, the relationship to family. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, it's partly just my own personal experience. In my early years as an economist, I worked a lot on civil rights and civil rights laws, and I really strongly believe that the Civil Rights Law in '64 did get rid of Jim Crow segregation in the South. And most of its effect was in the South, but it had real effect. I looked at that, and I looked at the mechanisms that was produced. But then as I looked further and got, it seemed at the point that Sol was making, and many people have made, and Sol makes it very powerfully, that you could see that somehow the affirmative action movement, the whole, so I was very concerned. A lot of reasons why Black progress slowed down. It wasn't, I mean, you know, the nature of industrial structure, skilled mismatch, and so forth. But what happens is I was working on this, and I kept working on it for quite a while. The longer I worked on this, the more I talked about it, the more I became denounced by people saying I was a racist. You know, basically you show those data. I've shown data like that. And I try to finish the story by saying those gaps are there, but that's called blaming the victim. And I literally am told that I'm blaming the victim. I'm not making a condemnation of anything, but what I am saying, I think those are the facts. And I was showing you that I think there are ways to address those gaps. I find it powerful that literally this IQ, you know, people worry a lot about IQ, the persistence of these behaviors over generations. they can be reduced. And it's not just those studies that I showed. There are many studies showing similar patterns. I'm doing a study in China that's very out in rural China. It has nothing to do with blacks and whites, but it has to do a lot with poverty. And there's some minority groups in the south of China that I'm working with. But the point is that I think that this becomes it's very hot, and I'm white. And so,
Really?
yeah, in case you noticed, in case you didn't notice, sorry. But I mean, no, but it's but there is what I think has really destroyed a lot of the discussion, and I personally feel this, is that there's so much discussion, at least, and even in my university, people saying, well, the only way you can talk about it is through the so-called lived experience. So if you look at data like I'm looking, I didn't live some of this experience. I'm not saying I did. I mean, I've seen other things, pretty bad, some of them, but that's not, and so there is a note that I would add a fourth point to your list.
My
No,
list of
people are
three
saying you
falsehoods.
have to be black in order to understand black problems.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that I understand all of black culture and black society. I've read pretty widely on this. I've read a lot of Du Bois and so. But the crucial thing, but I think what's really interesting and to me frightening is the fact that family structure issue is not playing the same role that I thought it would. That really is the case. That it's not just getting married.
Right.
It's what's going on in the family, and that what I was suggesting now was that what's going on has a lot to do with these parenting practices of the way things are going on.
So let's get into that. And I would
Mind if I
reiterate
use your water here?
No, to go right ahead. No, the first of my three falsehoods that racial disparities must be caused by racial discrimination is one of these anchor assumptions that gets in the way of real dialogue. And so I will want to talk to you about how do we get out of that? How do we create a permission structure that it's okay to say these things? So I want to come back to that. But yeah, let's talk about family, because I'm a big proponent that marriage will make a difference. Melissa Kearney will be here tomorrow morning. Not demonizing single mothers, of course, but marriage matters. But what your research indicates is that there's a more subtle idea, which is that there are sets of interventions that are practices that maybe perhaps are found in stable married to healthy parents, but actually we shouldn't say that the game is lost if a child is born not into those situations. Exactly. So talk about that. What are those specific interventions that perhaps could be replicated in other contexts?
Well, I think it's common sense, actually. We've seen what it is. I mean, what is parenting? Parenting is a kind of mentoring. We know that mentoring, I skipped over some slides of mentoring. There's some charter school results from a group at the University of Chicago where actually, again, children, and these are mostly disadvantaged kids, children from Woodlawn and Inglewood and so forth in Chicago, are not allowed to fail. But it's not social promotion. They're really staying with the kid, they're mentoring the kid, they're finding out where does the kid have, very time intensive. That's what parenting is. Really parenting, it doesn't even have to be a parent who's doing the parenting. And there are plenty of stories of that. For example, the J.D. Vance story about his grandma. His mother was a drug addict. He basically was raised by Mama, and Mama was not exactly highly educated in this. Right. She was crude and coarse in every which way, but she cared for the guy. And I think that's the important thing, is that there be a mentor or a set of mentors. So in Chicago, there were some studies done by sociologists when the Robert Taylor homes were still going. And the Robert Taylor homes environment in its final stages is really very violent. Lots of gangs, lots of crime, and so forth. However, it was an amazing number of kids growing up in the Robert Taylor homes who came out fully whole. And what was going on? It was the parent. Well, the parent. Some parent protected them. Maybe it was not even the parent. It could have been an aunt, an uncle, maybe some relative, or maybe somebody just off from another environment. But it was that kind of, that's the thing that's missing. Yeah. So somebody, a long time ago, I was interviewed and I started saying, what does it really matter? The secret ingredient is love. But I think it means, very soft. Dennis Robertson said that love was the scarcest thing in the economy. He didn't mean what I'm saying tonight, but it's a great thing to refer to. He's a famous Scottish economist. But I think this is a very costly activity to care for somebody. And the parenting activity, there's a name that, there's a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky. I don't know if you ever heard of him. Vygotsky built this theory, this was in the 1930s, he had this. But his idea was scaffolding. So he had this idea of saying, what do? You stay with the child, and all successful interventions have the same quality. You find the child where the child's at and you stay with it. But that's a very costly activity.
Yep.
And so parenting is costly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be two-parent families.
Doesn't have to be.
But they are frequently very successful. But don't forget, there are plenty of two-parent families that lead in bitter divorces and that lead with, and we know that turmoil inside, quote, stable two-parent family can really be very harmful for children.
No, these interventions can make a difference. So as many of the folks,
But it's not just, see, be careful. We're talking about a style. We're talking about parenting style. So it's how we approach other people. So it isn't like there's some government intervention here. We're talking about how we approach children and what we look for in them. So it's not like a curriculum.
Yep.
It's more like a style, a way of dealing with people.
So what's interesting, some of the people in this room may know that in addition to being a senior fellow at AEI, I also run public charter schools in the Bronx. And for 10 years, I ran a network of elementary and middle schools. And for years, when we got kids coming in at kindergarten, they were wholly underprepared, they didn't know their vocabulary, they weren't really school ready. So we started a pre-K program to get our students at 4 years old in partnership with Sesame Street. And even then, we saw 4-year-olds coming into school not school ready. So we decided to launch a parent-child home visiting program for the younger siblings of our current students, because those younger siblings, through sibling preference in the lottery, we knew they were coming into our school, and could there be a way we could reach them earlier? So this partnership, for 2 years, an early literacy specialist would go to the home 2 times per week, 30 minutes per visit, a new book each week. And the idea is that this early literacy specialist, who's typically from the neighborhood, typically spoke the language, would spend 30 minutes with the caregiver and the toddler, primarily to build the capacity of the caregiver.
Exactly.
And we found it incredibly effective on a whole range of areas. But one of the biggest challenges was finding early literacy specialists who could do this work. So how do you deal with the ideal, certainly I think you would agree, children being born into healthy, married, 2-parent households? That's not always a reality, but how would you address the scale issue, even of these kinds of stylistic programs that can, in some ways, replicate what we're seeing in healthy households?
Well, but again, I mean, the program you described is very similar, although a little richer than what is going on in this Jamaican program, which we've also taken to Gansu in Western China, which is also now in Colombia and around the world, in India and so forth. And what it has the same feature, that what you're doing is you're working with a parent. But I think there's probably less preparation. The students that are in, like we had a version of this program in Tibet. I went out way west of Lhasa, the Tibetan plain. And we went to these compounds where there were these very rural, very poor Tibetan people raising yaks and, doing very sick. And what was there was interesting was that the visitors were people just from other compounds.
Yep.
They weren't even high school graduates. Most of them were like maybe 8 or 9 years of school. That's kind of the norm in rural China, rural Tibet. And what we could do was those kids, though, and there were kids, a lot of them, young, mostly women, but not all, some boys, they were able, with some training from a more senior person, they were trained from really educated people who went there and trained them, but they were able at a fairly low level of skill to essentially, because what does it require? What are we saying? You're saying, see, it didn't even have literacy experts. These people actually, what did you do? The people in Jamaica actually made a point of making it affordable. So all materials in the Jamaican intervention had to come from the village dump. I mean, it had to be something that everybody could achieve. And what they did is they taught the mother or the caregiver or whatever to draw pictures, to tell stories, say, oh, there's Mr. Jones across the street. There's Mrs. X is taking the bus. That kind of interaction, we kind of ignore how valuable that is. But even at a very low level of intensity, I would bet you could go even worse in terms of quality standards. You could go lower. I mean, that's an open question though, because this is still very much in flux.
Yep.
But the thing about it, it's adaptable. It doesn't have any notion of kind of, the person coming in from the outer world and telling the people what to do, talking down. That's what Head Start was doing early on when it wasn't that successful. But the point is that I think we could do more in the sense of, not dumbing it down, but because even they're not literacy experts. These are high school kids.
Right.
Now, they've taken Chinese and math. They haven't even graduated high school,
Right.
but they're able to kind of communicate to these kids. And now we followed some of these kids until age 8, 9, 10.
Yep.
And so they're
Well, it's interesting because even the literacy specialists that I just described, they often were moms who were in the program themselves.
Okay, that's
who had
very
gone-
much-
who had
yeah.
gone through training.
Yeah, but see, there's a pretty ready, at least in places like Jamaica, in places certainly in China, these are more less. But we're now running a program like this in back of the yards in Chicago. We're starting it, and we're finding, at least at this stage, a lot of ready volunteers.
Yeah.
But the scale is, still very much.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. The part of the reason that we think this particular program was successful was that the caregivers already had children in our schools, so we had a relationship. So when we
right.
said we want to start this for your younger siblings, there was much more readiness to actually have someone come into your home 2 times per week. So anyway, so interesting. I think there's still a tension, and we're about to take questions, so please get your questions ready. There is a tension, though, between trying to create these kinds of experiences where you have potentially even low-skilled folks doing these kinds of supports.
Right.
And that's a necessary element because not every situation is perfect. But if you had to prioritize in terms of what we should be shooting for from a policy perspective or a culture perspective, should we be promoting the idea? And of course, this isn't mutually exclusive, but where would you put your emphasis on promoting, for example, the rising generation in terms of their own family formation or the ways in which we are developing children?
My experience, and again, I have a former student who's doing a lot of work in Texas now, Flavio Cunha. He's at Rice. Very bright guy, very active and running Texas Policy Institute there. But the one thing that's turned out to be very, very interesting is that I think parents underestimate their power. See, I think there's a resource that's untapped, that's there. It's not like we need to build, new programs and send bureaucrats out to, build another bureaucracy or something. I think parents don't realize. Cunha has these very interesting studies where he asks the mothers, what do you think a child's birth weight should be, new mothers? What should be the trajectory? Just get an idea what a normal course of development is. And a lot of the young disadvantaged mothers don't know. And when they're told, you can be very effective. If you tell your kid, you encourage the kid in various ways and then interact with the kid. A lot of I showed you the verbal. So a lot of people can speak. You don't have to speak the King's English, but you do interact and you're engaging the child. I think the secret is interaction. So anything that stimulates that interaction, I think, is going to go part way anyway. The full way, I don't know. But, fully functioning, normal families, not normal, but fully functioning 2-parent families, which have a lot of love and support, will do a lot of this. But it's enormously costly from a point of view. If you were to run a government program and said, I must send some bureaucrats out to do this, that would be very costly. But mother love and parental love plays a huge role.
Yep.
And the question is ways to kindle that. And I think that's what we don't think about as much. There's so much thinking, so much in the education school groups that I've dealt with. They think about these programs as like little classrooms. Here we are like baby Einsteins and various kinds of, we have a curriculum, like we're gonna have a curriculum for 3rd grade, we're having a curriculum for 3-year-olds. And they're missing the key ingredient, which is it's not a curriculum. It's just like in Perry. It's the kids were doing these things. They were planning, they were reviewing, and collectively they were judging each other's work too. So that's the reviewing part. But it's that interaction which is missing in a lot of environments. I think it's easier to stimulate that. There are groups, volunteer groups that do that, but they're typically not what we see in public schools or in the preschool programs.
So your thrust is building parental capacity
Yes.
to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, and parental
independent
awareness.
of structure and
Yes.
parental awareness.
Yeah.
Although I would argue that there's likely more receptivity to these ideas in an environment which is generally more of a married two-parent household. But the point that I think this is an important point
No,
that you're
but there are a
raising.
lot of kids growing up in
No,
single-parent
exactly.
families.
Right,
where and I think we see a lot of success stories.
Yes.
And that's where I'm very hesitant to move us into the two. You don't want shotgun weddings, I don't think, right? You do?
Well, I want more children raised in marriage. How about that?
Well, you want them raised in a nourishing environments,
Absolutely,
right?
of
But it
course.
could be an uncle who is completely in love with the kid and helping the kid. It doesn't, I mean, obviously it's better to have two parents who are both
Right.
doing. Two is better than one if they're both
There you
doing.
go.
Well, not if they're arguing.
Like we are right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fantastic. At this conference, we can actually agree and disagree, which is a very good thing. All right, we've got, oh my God, hands all over the place. Okay, let's start with Robert Cherry, then Howard, then Jeff.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was wondering why there wasn't any mention of the government programs that do much of this, like visiting nursing programs, parents as teachers. These programs have been pretty effective doing exactly what you're saying, that is giving knowledge. It's giving knowledge to parents for them to be better parents. And I think these, instead of looking for new programs, I think these programs against parents and teachers, particularly visiting nursing programs for 0 to 3-year-olds, they should be expanded.
Well, I mean, my objection there is really all the infrastructure and the boilerplate that goes with it. If you look at nurse-family partnership, there's a requirement that all the teachers go to Denver for a few months and get educated within the environment and the structural pattern of OLS. It's only a short-term program anyway, and I've actually evaluated it. It has moderate success. But the fact is, what I'm talking about is not that any one of these programs is necessarily bad, although I think the rigidity of these programs, I mean, like parents as teachers, we had this trial of Paris in Chicago 10 years ago, when the Chinese were considering using these programs out in rural China. I brought in people like parents as teachers, the one program you mentioned, nurse-family partnership, ABC, there were a lot of programs. And then we had the people from Jamaica. And the nice thing about the Jamaican program is it was cheap, it was effective, and it got right to the essence, I think, of what's going on, trying to stimulate parenting. And these other programs have all these requirements. We have these very expensive preschool program nearby in Inglewood. You go to that program, you know, it's funded by Kaiser, you know, this guy in Oklahoma, but he has a bunch of these programs, you know, like spending $30,000 a year. But, you know, these are Chinese and they weren't going to rural areas and they were looking at things, you know, trying to get something feasible that these small villages could support. And so what this did is it kind of peeled away. So I'm not denying those programs might be effective, but I'm saying there's a lot of unnecessary features of those programs. And when they work, and I have a paper on this subject, we looked at a variety of these programs. The set of those programs that are effective are the ones that encourage this kind of parenting interaction. And that's it. So I'm not saying those other programs are bad. Or I personally think there's a cheaper and better and more adjustable way to do this. But I'm not denouncing anybody in that regard. That's so, I agree.
Howard, thank you.
As I understand it, the Perry preschool program was one of the predicates for Head Start.
It's used in it. Part of it is, yes.
Why hasn't Head Start worked?
What do you mean? It's worked? It's worked.
Has it worked?
Yes. And in fact, this is one thing that's really very harmful. I mean, in this Project 2025 and the discussion, there was a Head Start experiment. There's a mania out there talking about what good, credible social science is, and that is you run an experiment. They ran an experiment with Head Start. They did. I analyzed this experiment. Klein and Walters analyzed this experiment. They randomly assigned kids to Head Start. Okay, where did the control group go? They went to other Head Start programs because Head Start is very decentralized. So they compared Head Start with Head Start and saw no difference. And then instead of comparing when you look at the studies of Head Start that have been done, the numerous studies, Pedro Carnero, Klein and Walters have the paper, I honestly believe you can do better than Head Start. I'm not saying it's the end all, but I'm honestly thinking that the representation of that program is really very faulty right now because of this experiment. And there are people who just believe in experiments. How can you believe in an experiment that's so contaminated? Literally, when people were randomized out, they either went to Head Start or it's something better because there are all these substitutes out there. Yeah. It's not like Head Start was existing and then nothing else existed. Believe me, there are lots of things. And the same thing is true with some of these programs, like in India, when Duflo was going on about some of these programs that are subsidizing young children, or young mothers, or young women, I should say, to make industry. And that she's comparing her program with about 40 others that are already active. So if they're randomized out of her program that she's studying, there will be about 39 other programs that are out there they go to. And people don't control for that. You can, but it's much more involved. So you see, that's the illusion. I would add that to the fifth thing. No, but you'll see it. People will say, this is a randomized trial and it's credible. You'll see that in a lot of the education school group. People will rant and rave about what's called the credibility revolution. And that means experiments or some version. And the problem is those things are very limited tools. It's very limited. Even our discussion of tariffs, which I think I won't get on. No, but I mean, seriously, the point is there are all these other effects that aren't captured, and I think we need to capture those. So, anyway, maybe you disagree with me.
Howard, let's have that discussion.
I was just wondering why, if we have it, why it hasn't been appreciated.
Well, no, it's interesting because partly I think this experiment has killed. There was a paper in Science magazine last year published by Duncan and a couple of others. These are all people from education schools, very strong. And they said, here's the uneasy evidence on early child care programs. And they ignored this whole body of evidence. There were body, many different studies of Head Start. Some of them running experiments, some of them looking at rollouts in different areas where some areas had Head Start, other areas didn't. They're comparable so they can see whether or not it worked. I think you can do better than Head Start, by the way. I'm not saying Head Start is great, but I mean, the evidence that it doesn't work, it's so shabby. And but that's another whole story. I can give you my personal experience with that, but you don't want to hear it. So.
Okay, so Rob, we'll go to you. And by the way, Rob Chatfield, we have Rob Chatfield to thank for that Thomas Sowell video that we saw at the beginning. That was quite well edited and presented. So thank you, Rob, and your question.
Thanks much. Jim, heard a lot about moms and not as much about dads. Is there just lack of data on single dads out there? And
well, I
what's
use
your concept
caretaker.
on
Be
dads?
careful. I use the word caretaker because dads can be caretakers. But this is something that's really important, that if we look at the way parenting is conducted in most countries around the world, the woman is playing the much greater role. I mean, when we get onto the issue about fertility declines and ask where are they the greatest and where they're the least, they're the greatest when the woman is playing is doing the lion's share of the work, and they're the least when she gets a lot of help and substitutes. There's a lot of evidence on that question. So there is an emerging issue here. Mothers are they give birth, they build the bond, we have that, but it's also the case that mothers are still doing the lion's share. I'm not saying God said that must be so, or maybe he did. They certainly gave them the power to have birth, but also there is a bond that as we speak now. So fathers have a role, but I don't think, and they do play a role. When you look at the gap, about boys raised without fathers, there's a big gap there, and fathers do play a role, especially for young kids, young boys. The absence of a father, because why? Because we think about what is learning occurring. Learning is taking how do we learn? See, this is another thing. It's not that we go to school and we, we imitate people. We see what's around us. And if we don't see a father, if we don't see a way to act as a boy, we don't see how to become a man in that way, I think we're at a handicap. So I would agree with you, it's important. But that's another whole discussion. But in what I looked at, I did talk about caregivers. And in fact, in some of these studies, like in the Jamaican study and so forth, there have been cases where the mother is absent. The father is definitely taking the role of a child. And it turns out in China, a lot of the mothers will go to the East Coast from the West and work in factories, and the father will stay behind. There is that. So, and they can be very effective too. So,
Scott, then Ralph.
Appreciate the talk. It's a great way to kick off the conference. I don't think I disagreed with much in the talk, except for maybe the first slide, and that means I'm agreeing with or disagreeing with both of you, perhaps.
well, that's good. We need help.
Yes.
I think when we find that there are these parenting differences by race, even controlling for family structure, even controlling for maternal education, I think the natural question that anyone has next is, well, what accounts for those parenting differences, right? And I think there's a real risk of leaving that question open and letting people's imaginations flourish. I would like to suggest that maybe what's behind them is in fact racial discrimination, not contemporary racial discrimination, but maybe racial discrimination 60 years ago. One of the ways in which black kids and white kids differ, even poor black kids and poor white kids differ, is in their experience of multi-generational poverty and their experience of concentrated poverty.
Right.
So I have a paper with Richard Reeves that we showed that if you're a 30-year-old in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, there's about a 1 in 5 chance that you're in your third generation of being in the bottom fifth if you're black and in your early 30s. If you're white and in your early 30s, it's a 1 in 100 chance. I have a paper that I'm working on right now that combines the experience of multi-generational poverty with long-term concentrated poverty. And the short version of the finding there is that if you're in your third generation of being in the bottom fifth and you're in a place that's been poor for 30 years, it's almost exclusively an African-American population. And even that doesn't necessarily mean that that's due to past racial discrimination, but certainly like the level of geographic segregation in American history has been a very different story for African Americans than for other groups. In some ways, maybe this doesn't matter if Perry Preschool works, if Head Start works, if Ian's charter schools work, doesn't really matter. But I wonder whether there's an important way that we come across as conservatives in the way that we talk about sort of root causes that we need to be sensitive to, I guess. I'd be curious to hear both your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, Will Riley speaks a lot about, is it that racial discrimination is a factor at all versus to what degree is it still a factor? And I think that's a fair, you should probably talk about that tomorrow. It's not that it's not an issue, but is it an insurmountable issue relative to these other factors?
Well, I think you're right about bringing in history. And I think what people forget, when I live on the south side of Chicago, same place that where Glenn has escaped, but I'm a resident. I was born there and I lived there most of my life. And what you see is something that's very important. And I mean, again, talking about the way learning occurs, part of this social learning is learning from grandparents and learning from people who truly experienced atrocious conditions. We have people living on the south side of Chicago who were denied access to bathrooms like 50, 60 years ago. They're still alive. They're still talking to their and they're helping educate. And it's not like they're malicious. They're just speaking the truth. They're telling the kid what went on when they were young kids themselves. And that must have some effect. If that's what you're getting at, I think there's very strong effect. And some of it also be the discrimination in education. You saw those graphs that were there, that learning more educated people are doing better, more educated parents. And if you look at the history of discrimination in education, think of what the gaps were in 1940. They were enormous. Now they're much less, but they're still big. So I do think and those are the grandparents. And, I didn't mention that, but grandparents are another major source. Bob Pollack has written a lot about this. Grandparents, there's a whole emphasis or grandparents retire and, raise kids and so forth. So there is a huge cultural factor there. And I think that accounts for the sluggishness of this. There's a real memory that's there. And it's hard for that to just disappear. So I think it's a residue, and I don't know how to get around it. So I don't think you said or I said that somehow we've moved beyond it completely. But I do think that, but that's much harder in some sense. But I also think, however, that the way that, the discussion of Black history and the discussion of the way history is told is completely dangerous in this regard, because it emphasizes on the very worst. It doesn't emphasize at all about this progress between 40 and 60. It's emphasizing always the Tulsa riots, the riots in Dover and other places, and I think that perpetuates a sense of pessimism, don't you?
Yeah, and we also, and then Ralph, I want to get to you. We have to also acknowledge the challenges that exist. Like you were talking about Chicago, WirePoint's just released data that there are 80 schools in the state of Illinois in which 0 students passed the state math
Right.
exam.
Proficiency levels is close to 0.
But
In my
rather-
neighborhood, by
right,
the way.
But there are all these anti-choice laws in Illinois impeding the ability of young people. So is that racial discrimination, especially when many of the legislators are in fact Black? So it's these things get intermingled, and so it's hard to pinpoint.
But
what the causality is.
now we're going on areas
but-
I would never speak publicly about.
I've
I
given
hope
you
it's
freedom.
enclosed, in camera here. But quite seriously, I mean, when you see this, like, for example, my mayor, who's kind of infamous in his own, there was some discussion about
Chicago
charter
mayor.
schools and he was saying, all these Republicans, they've forgotten that the North won the Civil War and they want to enslave. All this appeal, the rhetoric is there and it seems to be effective. That's what I don't understand. You can pull a race card out and it just impedes these kinds of choices. They'll say, oh, this is trying to destroy Black, or take 1619 out of the classroom. It's in the classroom for Chicago public schools.
I'm aware.
And they're learning something which is just wrong. They're just learning a history, and it's a distorting history. And that's what I worry about. I had a postdoc from China. When she left, she lived in Chicago a few years, and one of her parting remarks was, what you're doing, and these were in the neighborhoods, these are predominantly Black students, is you're teaching children how to hate. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But it's politically convenient to do that. But it's dangerous socially, right? To have these. You say you want to, you want to abolish, history of what really happened. You want to teach it for sure. But somehow to just dwell on it and to have Black History Month only focusing on the bad.
That is a whole topic.
Yeah, it's a
unto
whole
itself, for
topic.
sure.
But it does affect the nature of the perception of these children about their expectations.
Absolutely.
And it bothers me.
So this is our final question, Ralph Mangual, and then we're going to go get some dessert. But Ralph.
Thank you. I think you may have actually just started to hint at the answer to my question, but you said, you noted the differences between two-parent married households with respect to life outcomes and single-family households, and there's no doubt that two-parent households are better. But you said that it wasn't necessarily marriage per se that was driving the results. Rather, you said that marriage was a signal of a healthy environment.
It is.
But there has been a sharp decline in marriage in the Black community.
Correct.
There's been a sharp increase in out-of-wedlock childbearing. Do you have any theories about what is causing the unhealthiness? What is causing the lack of healthy environments that drive people to stick to institutions like marriage?
Well, that is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just the Blacks. If you're starting, you're getting a sense that now we're trying a new social order. And so some of the traditional roles of men and women and the way society was organized, those are under question everywhere. Forget about the United States, forget about any Black American. We can talk about Denmark or China or anything else to varying degrees. So I think we are seeing a redefinition of the roles. And in fact, I've been writing some papers on this, but You know, you think about the way marriage is actually working, we think of it as like a bargaining model. And literally, Pollock and Lundberg have written a lot on this. And so what you're getting is basically, you know, the bargaining. But the women have now come to the bargain with very different strengths now. They have a better market, labor market. They have better laws protecting them in the event of divorce. They're able to protect assets and this then gives them a bargaining power. So what we're seeing in the family structure is a change in the terms of what marriage is. And you can measure that actually. You can literally, some economists have been estimating the share of goods going to the mother as a result, or the wife, I should say, as a result of her having higher wages and greater bargaining power. So you can literally see that the share, Jeremy Leese and his co-authors have done a very brilliant job on this. And this affects things like fertility and the whole structure of marriage. But the marriage market for males, in particular black males, I mean, people have written all about the incarceration, you know, the boom in incarceration. And that's part of it. That doesn't explain 1960s, but it does in the 1980s have a very negative effect, don't you think? And in fact, you're getting a lot of black males taken out. I mean, in my own neighbors, one of my activities when I was, you know, there people come up and ask for money. They're always black, and this is in Chicago, South Side. And I would ask them a question, which may sound very bold, but I was in Chicago and I had an idea, and they looked a little bit down and out. And I would ask them, when did you get out?
Wow.
And they all gave me an answer. It was a straight answer. There was no animosity. I bought them coffee. We sat around and talked, how was your experience in jail and so, and it was all very good because it was part of the social ethos, right? If you look at less educated dropout males, right? You're getting like 2/3 of them are gonna have some contact with the criminal justice system. I think that's right, isn't that statistic? About 2/3. Now, these are the dropouts. And so you're getting this subclass, and that has huge implications for the marriage market. Because you see the way, talk about a gap, we talk about the black-white gap. Think of the male-female gap within the black community. And the fact that women are doing so much better. They're going to, you know, the black female rate is actually, in terms of going to college and participating in a lot of activities, exceeding now the white male rate. The white male rate in some environments. This to me is like staggering, but it's really suggesting the problems of the white males and the benefits that black. So there is a bifurcation, and you know, there's a book that was written, I've forgotten the name of the author, but it's a good book, you know, basically saying, I don't want to get married because I can't find anybody who's worth it, right? I've forgotten the name of the book. Who's that?
It's probably Kathy Eden.
Eden, that's it. It's Kathy Eden. But so that's changed the nature of the marriage market too. The women have stronger, greater bargaining power, and they use it. So then the question, do they have children or not? That's another whole question. And being single is a serious issue in terms of financial assets, right? I mean, you're struggling. Anyway, sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Heckman has helped us launch a great wide-ranging discussion. Tomorrow, we're actually going to follow up on a number of these themes, starting in the morning with Melissa Kearney talking about two-parent privilege, with Benny talking about neighborhoods and place, Ralph talking about crime. We've got learning loss. It's going to be a great day. So please thank you again.
Thank you.
Tomorrow morning, we have breakfast, I think it's 7:45. Please come here early because our first session starts at 8:15 with Melissa Kearney, who's got a great presentation. But tonight, we're not yet done. If you'd like to hang out a little bit more, we're going to the gallery for dessert, which is just right outside. So thank you for joining us. This was a great first discussion, and onward.